think a man working outdoors feels more like a man if you can have a bottle of suds.
Give me one of those famous giant beers I heard so much about.
It's like a reward.
For centuries, German culture has been intrinsically linked with their beloved beer culture. But despite the Munich Oktoberfest bringing in record numbers in recent years, with millions lining up for an iconic Maßkrug of beer, Germans are drinking less. A lot less. On August 1st of this year, Germany's statistical office announced that in the first half of 2025, 6-month beer sales had fallen below 4 billion liters for the very first time since they began counting in 1993.
I came very close to spitting out beer.
Just as in other beer drinking countries like Belgium, the United Kingdom, and the United States, per capita consumption of beer has also decreased substantially in Germany over the past 50 years. Between 1976, when per capita beer consumption reached a peak of 150 liters per year, and 2017, the average German's beer consumption has dropped by almost 50%. Germany remains the 6th largest beer market in the world. But where Germans once downed more than anyone, bar the insatiable Czechs, they are now 8th in the per-person league table. So what's sparking this change? Are Germany's strict purity laws to blame? And how are German breweries reinventing themselves and their products to remain profitable in a changing market? Well, let's take a look. At the center of many cities, towns, and villages here in Germany, you'll find a Rathaus, a city hall, or a market square with a lively farmer's market, typically a beautiful cathedral, and traditionally, a brewery or two. Just as different townships or regions will have their own traditional food, dress, or music, in Germany, beer is also part of that localized tradition. It's a drink steeped in history, habit, climate, and culinary preference of the specific place in which it was produced. In fact, although the Germans didn't invent beer, German monasteries have been producing beer for mass consumption since around the end of the first millennium, or the year 1000. These beer-producing monasteries were predominantly located in southern Germany, and some of them are still around today, such as the Bavarian state brewery Weihenstephan, which is considered the oldest brewery in the world. And so, like many other villages in southern Germany, the local brewery in my neck of the woods wasn't just a business, but a cultural and community gathering place that held a long and storied history. But 4 years ago, after 153 years of brewing tradition, they brewed their last bottle of beer. But the fate of this brewery, sadly, isn't unique. Between 2023 and 2024, Germany lost over 50 breweries nationwide, and other breweries such as Langbrau and Brauerei Herold ceased brewing operations in 2025. And while sure, these specific breweries are not famous on an international scale such as Kronbacher or Warsteiner, both of them were centuries old and traditional breweries within their regions, making their closures notable. Plus, if we take a look at last year's figures from the German Federal Statistical Office, both domestic and international sales are slowing. Specifically to the latter, in 2024, Germany exported 1.45 billion liters of beer last year, marking a 6% decline compared to 10 years prior in 2014. Notably, more than half of these exports were shipped to fellow EU member states. But it isn't just that our neighbors are less thirsty for a good German Hefeweizen or Pilsner, though they are, but rather the German consumers themselves are drinking a lot less beer than they used to. In fact, beer sales are at their lowest level in more than 30 years. Within Germany, it slumped to 6.8 billion liters last year, a volume figure that was markedly down a shocking 15.1% compared to a decade ago. So naturally, as sales shrink, so too has the number of breweries. And nationwide, Germany counted 1,459 breweries in 2024, around 7.4% more than 2014. However, that figure is still plummeting from its pre-pandemic peak of 1,552 in 2019. But these closures are really quite alarming because it cannot be understated how unique and localized the German beer manufacturing business is. For now. The German market is still dominated by breweries which are either privately or state-owned, which is unique from a wider perspective, as the situation is different for the world's largest beer companies. Anheuser-Busch InBev, also known as AB InBev, Heineken, China Resources Snow Breweries, Molson Coors Brewery, and Carlsberg are publicly traded and account for 60% of global beer production. However, they are significantly underrepresented in the world's 6th largest beer market of Germany. Although notice the asterisks here, as AB InBev has been quietly buying up German brands like Beck's, and Heineken owns a minority stake in Polana. So it isn't clear-cut. But nonetheless, Germany's beer market is still characterized by a relatively low market concentration. Approximately 90% of all breweries in Germany are independently owned. Now, in many other countries, one of the ways that you can carve out your niche and stay profitable in the market as a small brewer is to be inventive, interesting, and different. But experimenting with your beer is actually pretty challenging here in Germany, and some have called into question as to whether or not Germany's notoriously restrictive law on brewing beer is at least partially to blame. And to illustrate, I want to show you another beer. This is a bottle of Schwarzer Abt, a beer brewed by the Klosterbrauerei Neuzelle, a monastery brewery north of Berlin. But despite being brewed with the same monk's recipe since 1410, a lengthy legal dispute known as the Brandenburg Bierkrieg, or the Brandenburg Beer War, ensued over whether or not this German beer could be legally sold as beer in Germany. Let me explain. Elsewhere around the world, brewers use a variety of different starchy grains as a base for the malt. Barley, rye, spelt, emmer wheat, semanilla wheat, or even rice or maize. But to do so in Germany isn't just sacrilegious, it's illegal. You see, more than 500 years ago, way back in the year 1516, Munich's Duke Wilhelm IV codified the German beer purity law, or the Reinheitsgebot, a medieval food safety rule which deemed that beer could contain nothing other than water, barley, hops, and later also yeast. But while the law certainly prevented their subjects from food poisoning, their main aim seems to have been something else: bread. In order to produce it, grains such as wheat and rye were needed, but they were not always available. So in order to ensure that brewers did not fill their tanks with them, they were ordered to only use barley, less suitable for bread, onwards. So although beer and Brot are two important staples of the German diet, we don't really need the law to safeguard production today. And interestingly, until the mid-20th century, the Reinheitsgebot was relatively unknown and applied very unevenly across Germany. However, in the mid-20th century, Bavarian brewers rallied around the Reinheitsgebot to protect themselves against competition amid European market integration. And quite frankly, that isn't all that dissimilar to other protected designations of origin and geographic protections of other foods, like I've mentioned in other videos, which I'll go ahead and link up here in the corner. The revised Provisional Beer Law of 1993, which replaced the earlier regulations, is a slightly expanded version of this Reinheitsgebot, stipulating that only water, malted barley, hops, and yeast can be used for any bottom fermented beer brewed in Germany. Top fermented beer is subject to the same rules, with the addition that a wider variety of malted grains can be used, as well as pure sugars to flavor and color. But this 5 centuries old regulation continues to have staying power because many argue it is precisely this precision and tradition that helped German beer to gain its international regard, distinction, and reputation as being the best of the best. In fact, a recent survey found that 85% of German consumers feel that despite the narrow definition of what constitutes a German beer, it should still continue to be upheld. Nonetheless, the strict rules do generate sticky consequences. In the late 1980s, French brewers sued, and the European Court of Justice found that the Reinheitsgebot was protectionist and therefore in violation of Article 30 of the Treaty of Rome. So all of this means that today, the German purity law only applies to beer brewed in Germany and not to imported beer. But what happens when you are a medieval brewery that suddenly goes from being a foreign import to a domestic beer overnight? Well, that's where that Schwarzer Abt comes back into this story. You see, after German reunification in 1990, this former monastery brewery in the East German town of Neuzelle Brandenburg was warned to stop selling its black beer as it contained high concentrations of sugar, violating the German beer purity law. That's right. Despite predating the German purity law itself, an over decades-long legal battle between the brewery and the state of Brandenburg ensued over whether or not this German beer could be deemed beer in Germany at all. Now, thankfully, following an appeal directly to the Federal Administrative Court in Leipzig, the final ruling was issued in early 2005, siding with the brewery. But it does highlight the restrictive and complicated nature of producing beer here in Germany. As I mentioned earlier, German brewers can only use the specific ingredients if they want to officially call their brews beer. If they don't comply, they still might be able to label it beer, but only if they subsequently export the stuff. Foreign brewers, in turn, can only sell non-Reinheitsgebot beer on German soil when it's not brewed there. This situation means that many German craft brewers themselves export most of their beers. And when it comes to domestic sales, German microbrewers who want to experiment with their beer can only sell it in Germany if they label it beer style, or refer to it specifically as an IPA or a pale ale or a stout, which, to be honest, feels a little silly that you have to market it this way with this loophole. Like, it's not a beer, it's an IPA, which is still a beer. But nonetheless, because of this, many craft brewers have spoken out against the German beer purity law, arguing that it removes creative license and perpetuates a market of very similar beers, which I think there is a kernel of truth to. For years, market conditions for smaller breweries had become increasingly challenging. Declining beer sales, rising raw material prices, difficulties in procuring supplies and operating materials, and the market share of the big breweries means that beer production at many locally owned small breweries was just simply no longer profitable. Today, craft breweries, broadly speaking, those not brewed by large corporations but by small independent brewers, despite holding 90% of the total number of breweries in Germany, constitute a very small portion of the German beer market, just 1 to 3%. And that's significant because when you compare it to another beer-centric culture like the United States, where craft beer holds a market share of 13.3% by volume and 24.7% of retail dollar sales, this is a significant difference. Many of the local beer companies in the United States, for example, recognize that being inventive, creative, and different is their pathway to success and profitability. But in Germany, local brewers are facing a complex and costly uphill battle. But costly and complex problems aren't only reserved for German businesses. I recently found myself needing to send emails with some pretty sensitive personal and financial information. The problem is, how could I be sure that the email I sent is actually secure? Well, I wasn't being paranoid, it's a real problem. Sending a routine email is like writing your message on an old postcard sent through hand-delivered mail. Yikes. Unless, of course, you use Proton Mail, who is sponsoring this week's video. You see, the most popular email providers like Gmail, Outlook, and Yahoo scan the content of your emails and use your email address to create a detailed profile. and profit from your data. But by protecting your emails with end-to-end and zero-access encryption with Proton Mail means that absolutely no one, not even the employees at Proton, are able to read your emails, keeping your messages safe from data breaches or surveillance, which is exactly what prompted me to make the switch. In fact, end-to-end encryption is offered across the board on all of Proton's products, as well as a no-logs policy. And since Proton operates from Switzerland, you also benefit from robust privacy laws. Plus, if you're someone who needs to send sensitive information, like me, you can send encrypted, password-protected emails to anyone, even people who don't use Proton Mail. The recipient receives a link to access the message, which they can unlock using a shared password. And it is super easy to make the switch. Their Easy Switch feature means that you can securely import your emails, contacts, and calendar events from other email providers straight into your Proton account. And once you transfer your data to Proton Mail, everything is encrypted upon arrival in your new inbox, allowing for a secure transition to a privacy-focused email service. So take control of your online experience, free from censorship and data exploitation. Sign up with Proton Mail today for free over in the link in my description at proton.me/TyBastian. Just looking around, one can easily argue that Germans greatly prefer local beer. Different beer styles corresponding to certain German regions have emerged over time, and accordingly, research shows that German consumers are highly loyal towards regional beer brands. Here in Baden-Württemberg, where I live, the state-owned Rothaus is a very popular and iconic beer brand, and others such as Ganter, Kettere, and Fürstenberg are highly recognized and popular breweries from the region. But the king of beers and brewing legacy is, of course, Bavaria, who boasts over 600 breweries, making it not only the standout state within Germany, but also the beer capital of Europe and one of the top per capita worldwide, which is certainly impressive. However, as I mentioned earlier, that number is shrinking. At the start of the 19th century, there were almost 30,000 breweries in Bavaria. Most of them were small village breweries that supplied the inns in the local area. Almost every monastery and almost every inn had its own brewery. Well, to illustrate, I'd like to chat a little more about a beer that I mentioned earlier in this video, Langbrau. Located in northern Bavaria for 172 years, the Langbrau Brewery survived 2 world wars and the tension of the Iron Curtain, but sadly, not its recent financial challenges. As the cost of energy and staff rose in recent years, and with cutthroat supermarkets dominating sales, beer prices remained largely static. But the final blow to the business was their inability to secure funding for the future. Citing a cost of 12 million euros for modernization, the owners decided to close their doors this past year. You see, long-term forecasts for the beer market show that tastes and preferences are changing. Now, much of this change in consumer drinking habits has been attributed to the rise in popularity of non-alcoholic beers, particularly amongst younger generations. According to the International Wine and Spirits Record, the growing popularity and increasing availability of no-alcohol beer continues to be the driver of organic growth. Preliminary data shows no-alcohol beer grew by 20% in 2024 versus 2023, and the sector is projected to hit 3.8 trillion euros globally by 2034. And again, the buyers of the non-alcoholic category are typically younger. In addition to drinking less overall, Gen Z makes up 17% of the alcohol-free market, with millennials and Gen Z together accounting for nearly 2/3 worldwide. Now, interestingly, the statistics for Germany specifically are a little bit different. There isn't as significant as a generational shift. Non-alcoholic beer has been widely available on the market here for much longer, and low-alcohol options like Radlers are accepted as a culinary staple, whereas they're now kind of just slowly becoming popular in the United States. Nonetheless, although 9 out of 10 beers sold contain alcohol, the production of non-alcoholic versions has nearly doubled in 10 years. Today, there are over 800 varieties available on the German market. Now, for large manufacturers, this niche has become a priority, but making the shift to near beer or non-alcoholic beverage options is extremely costly for local breweries. You see, in order to replicate the flavor of the traditional beer, the more sophisticated process involves brewing the entire beer and then removing the alcohol afterwards. But to do so, this method utilizes expensive equipment, requiring investments that can exceed €1 million. So of course, not all companies can afford these kinds of costs, especially smaller breweries who often resort to simpler methods, such as stopping fermentation before it's finished. While inexpensive, the result is often sweeter, which drives away a lot of consumers. In contrast, large companies are more flexible to make this shift, quickly launch new products, and buy up those smaller brands. But one thing is clear. With so many options now available to the consumer, the principal challenge for large and small breweries alike is innovate or die. Tradition and history don't necessarily guarantee survival, and despite the deep cultural symbology of German beer, many consumers are redefining their relationship with this traditional beverage. So I'm actually really curious to know your thoughts down below in the comment section of this video. First, if you're a beer drinker, what's your favorite beer to consume? And regardless of your drinking preferences, what do you think about the changes happening in the beer market and local breweries? Let me know your thoughts down below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers, and if you're enjoying a beer, Prost.